table. I want to welcome you. We have incredible first ministers right around this great country, and the message is let's stay united as we move forward. There's a lot of large infrastructure projects that we'd like to discuss, no matter if it's pipelines, as Premier Smith is always mentioning, which I agree, going east, going west, going north, going south, building large infrastructure projects like rail and ports as well, along with critical minerals, the Ring of Fire. But these are all the areas that we'd love to discuss and move forward. But again, welcome everyone, and isn't this great? We're in the War Museum. So economic war we're facing right now as a country, but we're going to stay united. We're going to fight like we've never fought before to protect our sovereignty and our interests and our economy. So thank you very much for the opening remarks. Thank you.
Merci. Thank you very much, Doug. And with that, I might ask that we go into camera. Just take a moment to move to our formal agenda.
In a way, Mark Carney had no choice.
Prime Minister Mark Carney will ask the Governor General to dissolve Parliament and will call a snap federal election this Sunday.
He's on the clock. Parliament has been on pause for more than 2 months now, but set to resume on Monday, March 24th. And on that day, his government would have to face down every other party leader who has sworn one simple thing.
New Democrats will be voting against this government for an election
to choose a new parliament composition.
Non-confidence motion at the earliest possible opportunity.
But even that, of course, may not be the real thrust of what might become the biggest political gamble of Mark Carney's career.
I think if Mark Carney could actually have the vote today, he'd probably do it because he has got momentum on his side.
If Mark Carney does call an election as expected, and he has any hint of a hopeful smile while doing it, this is why. What you're looking at here is an average of every publicly available major poll in Canada. Polling numbers that for nearly the last 2 years have predicted a crushing Liberal defeat, but that have since sharply turned around over just the last 2 months. The Liberals would have to go back years to find a time when they were polling ahead of the Conservatives, but they are now. In a CBC poll tracker simulation of 5,000 possible election results, taking each party's range of projected outcomes into account, the Liberals have a staggering 77% chance of winning. And check those odds on winning a majority. If an election were held today, based on current polling, the projection is for the Liberals to win 176 seats. That's a very slim majority, but what would have been unthinkably strong results just a few months ago.
I remember looking at the numbers just as Chrystia Freeland was resigning as finance minister. The Liberals were projected to win fewer seats than the Bloc Québécois, not in Quebec, from coast to coast.
It's the shift in the poll is wild. Everybody was writing the Liberals' obituary, frankly. And once Trudeau said he was going to step aside, immediately there seemed to be a shift in the mood, a shift in the polls. Then Donald Trump comes in and he ramps up his talk of tariffs. So I think those factors contributed to a real reversal in what we were seeing in terms of popular support.
Now, let me be clear. Polls and projections are not outcomes. They can also be wrong, but they're helpful to identify changes over time, shifts in momentum. And what is undeniably true is that Canadians have had to deal with a major change over the last 2 months.
I'd like to see Canada become our 51st state.
We have a tremendous deficit with Canada.
We don't need them to make our cars. We don't need them to give us lumber.
We subsidize Canada by the tune of about $200 billion a year. And for what?
This has played to the advantage of the Liberals for two big reasons. One, they're the party in power. They've had first crack at making a stand against Donald Trump's second term in the White House.
There's no question that it has been to the benefit of the Liberals, Mark Carney in particular. But you saw the public's view of Trudeau improve in those last few weeks as he was the primary voice standing up to Donald Trump saying, never a 51st state, when he was the one on the line having those conversations.
But the other reason Trump has been a gift to the political fortunes of the Liberal Party is that he has pulled the conversation away from what was the Conservatives' strongest set of arguments.
We need to trigger an axe the tax election as soon as possible.
The problem with spending more money as a solution to inflation is that it simply pours more gasoline on the inflationary fire.
Radical, uncontrolled immigration.
We don't need more bureaucracy, we need more homes.
I should say, these continue to be major issues in this country, and in many cases, the number one issue for many Canadians. In Western Canada, the Conservatives maintain strong polling leads. Again, when we look at the average of all major polls. But for many other Canadians, all of a sudden, there's a new pressing issue here.
Canada's a very bad abuser.
Think of how beautiful that country would be without that artificial line running right through it. Somebody drew it many years ago with a ruler, just a line.
Before Trump, it was affordability, really a big front and center issue. But if you look at the public opinion polling, the thing right underneath it is Donald Trump. And it's hard to disentangle those two things.
For any Canadians who now feel Donald Trump is what looms largest, the most imminent threat is tariffs.
The threat of tariffs themselves has hurt our economy, right? Businesses are holding off on investment. They're choosing to invest in the United States.
When people are worried about the effect on tariffs, they're worried about the effect on the economy. They're worried about jobs. They're worried about the cost of things, whether they're going to be able to make their rent and their mortgage.
Because, have you been keeping track of them all? There are potentially general tariffs on everything.
Tomorrow, tariffs 25% on Canada.
There are reciprocal tariffs coming in April.
Whatever they tariff us, other countries, we will tariff them. That's reciprocal, back and forth.
There are tariffs on steel and aluminum.
We're doing a 25% tariff on steel and aluminum.
Also threats on Canadian lumber.
We don't need trees from Canada. We have lumber. We have the best lumber.
The auto manufacturing sector.
We certainly don't want their automobiles. I'd rather have them made in Michigan.
And Canadian dairy under siege too.
Nobody ever talks about that. 250% tariff, which is taking advantage of our farmers.
All of these things threaten to make buying things and earning a living in Canada much more difficult. Tariffs just weren't part of the equation before Trump took office, and they go a long way in predicting how the next Canadian election will play out. But there's also the more existential threat that not all Canadians take seriously, but some do.
If they became our 51st state, it'd be the greatest thing they could ever do.
I mean, we're never going to be the 51st state, but it causes us to be on edge all the time and wonder what the heck this guy is up to.
Canadians are really proud of this country. There are certainly many things to criticize in our past. There are things to criticize in our present in terms of how the country is run. But fundamentally, people feel very strongly about living here.
And consider for a moment how difficult it might be to make the election about looking inward, about purely domestic issues, when Trump himself seems perfectly willing to inject himself into Canadian politics directly.
The conservative that's running is stupidly no friend of mine. I don't know him, but he said negative things. So when he says negative things, I couldn't care less. I think it's easier to deal, actually, with a liberal.
It's clear that President Trump wants the Liberals in power because they will keep this country weak. That's exactly the kind of weak, compromised, conflicted leadership that Donald Trump wants, and it's why he endorsed Mark Carney yesterday.
Pierre Poilievre was very keen to talk about those remarks, and that's because they are politically beneficial to him. He knows that one of the attacks from the Liberals is going to be that Pierre Poilievre is the Canadian version of Donald Trump. Chrystia Freeland liked to say maple syrup MAGA. And so when Pierre Poilievre can point to comments like that, where Donald Trump does not seem to particularly like him, he's saying to Canadians, listen, I am not simpatico with this guy that you are feeling so angry at, so betrayed by.
So look, the election is now almost certainly just around the corner. The Conservatives have a clear game plan. Undermine Mark Carney.
He has conflicts of interest that he will have to manage, but he won't tell us what those conflicts are.
And Poilievre must try to convince Canadians of what he says they've lost under successive Liberal governments.
That is the lost Liberal decade, a decade during which the Liberals were in power and Mark Carney was, for half of that time, the economic advisor to Justin Trudeau.
He is trying to demonstrate that he's much more serious about the cost of living issue. In good economic times, we're all for the environment. When we have economic instability, when people are concerned about just putting food on the table, concern for environment just plummets. In that context, they obviously think they have a winning combination.
But the Liberals, their challenge is to keep whatever momentum they have going.
We can stand up for ourselves. We've called out those comments. They're disrespectful, they're not helpful, and they need to stop.
Translation, they will want to play their trump card as hard and often and for as long as possible. First, they were on.
We will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens.
25% on Mexico and Canada.
Then they were off.
President Trump's tariffs against Canada will now be put on hold.
Then, while the first set of tariffs were paused, Trump threatens a whole new second set of tariffs, and then threatens a third set of tariffs, reciprocal tariffs stacked on top. But eventually, he loops back to the first original tariffs, promising they're definitely coming.
On the tariffs, is there any room left for Canada and Mexico to make a deal before midnight? And should we expect those Chinese tariffs, the extra 10%, to take
No room left for Mexico or for Canada. No, the tariffs, they're all set. They go into effect tomorrow.
And then those tariffs became real until they weren't anymore because they were partially delayed.
We spoke with the big three auto dealers. We are going to give a 1-month exemption on any autos coming through USMCA.
And then a big chunk of what was left of the tariffs was paused again. Here's how Trump justified it.
And I spoke to the president of Mexico, wonderful woman, today, and we helped them out with the problem they were having to do with the tariffs.
I helped them out with a problem they were having, as in the problem he inflicted and then paused, and then re-inflicted and then paused. Are these the actions of a man who knows what he's doing? Maybe not, but maybe. There are two main schools of thought when it comes to how Donald Trump is managing the world's largest economy. Either the pandemonium is planned.
Yeah, I think chaos is a big part of Trump's strategy.
There's a term that applies to what the Trump administration is doing: weaponized uncertainty.
Or
another possibility is Trump just likes the attention, just likes the drama.
I don't think there's a genuine economic strategy behind it.
Let's start with that. The argument that Trump has no coherent plan is supported by the fact that he sometimes has no consistent point of view. Take tariffs, for example.
Canada's a very bad abuser also. Vast numbers of people to come in and fentanyl to come in.
Legally, Trump has justified tariffs by branding the influx of fentanyl from Canada and Mexico a national emergency. But is that really the motivation? Or is it about boosting American manufacturing?
We don't need trees from Canada. We don't need cars from Canada. We don't need energy from Canada. We don't need anything from Canada.
Sometimes it seems to be about the principle.
Subsidizing Canada to the tune of over $100 billion a year.
By the tune of about $200 billion a year.
And other times it seems to be more about power.
I'd like to see Canada become our 51st state.
He feels strongly that it would be very beneficial for the Canadian people to be the 51st state of the United States. They wouldn't be paying for these tariffs.
And what about the occasional lack of a unified message? Trump's own team sometimes seems left in the dark. Like whatever Trump was planning, if he was planning any of it, was never actually discussed out in the open. Take what Trump's Commerce Secretary said earlier this week on Fox News about tariffs against Canada and Mexico.
So I think he's going to work something out with them. It's not going to be a pause, none of that pause stuff, but I think he's going to figure out, you do more, and I'll meet you in the middle some way, and we're going to probably be announcing that tomorrow.
Except this was wrong. 2 days later, Trump did, in fact, issue a significant tariff pause.
We saw this a bit in the first term, but not nearly to this extent. But if you were to put a timeline of promises backtracking, it's just a zigzag pattern.
And this zigzagging isn't necessarily only a communication thing. Sometimes Trump's policies just aren't properly thought out.
President Trump has announced new tariffs on China that removed the de minimis exemption.
On February 1st, Trump issued an executive order that taxed Chinese imports under $800. For years, those imports had been duty-free. But then, 1 week later, Trump completely reversed course because there was no plan for how the U.S. Postal Service was supposed to suddenly process brand new taxes on the mountain of stuff Americans order every day from sites like Temu and Shein. Packages started getting backlogged, so now this order is on hold until they figure it out.
It's the whims of somebody who seems to change his mind as fast as the rest of us change our underwear.
There's the constant drama, impulse control. If you want to make the case that there's a master plan, What is that master plan?
And there are countless examples of this apparent lack of a master plan, because many of the consequences that seem to invariably force Trump to take back what he says are foreseeable. The biggest example of this is how tariffs would affect the auto sector.
I'm afraid for both sides, for my workers, for the workers in the United States, but it's devastating. It'll devastate us.
Car manufacturing supply chains across Canada, the US, and Mexico are highly integrated and interdependent. Millions of parts and vehicles flow between the three countries every year, and economists predicted a 25% tariff would increase the cost to make each vehicle by thousands of dollars.
This industry has been integrated and grown together for decades. You can't unscramble the omelet one morning because you decide, you know what, you want to have a fried egg or a boiled egg. You made the omelet. You can't turn it into eggs over easy.
But it was only after Trump had dangled the threat of tariffs for 2 months and then actually enacted them that he decided, no, wait, I can't do that. I have to hit pause.
It's just a modification short term because I didn't want to hurt the American. It would have hurt the American car companies if I did that.
It was predictable to anyone paying attention to the details. I mean, the auto sector is so heavily integrated that, a piece goes back and forth multiple times. You can't build a car under these circumstances.
And the entire time Trump spends changing his mind, there's material harm to American businesses because they don't know which suppliers to use or what prices to charge.
What he's doing is he's creating uncertainty for people and companies that have to make pending investment decisions or future capital planning.
And consider one of Trump's most prized metrics for success.
Since my election, the stock market has set records. Everybody's stock has done well since the election.
But nowadays, asked by reporters whether his latest pause on tariffs had anything to do with stock market performance.
Well, no, nothing to do with the market. I'm not even looking at the market.
Because the market has slumped.
Stocks continue to fall today with fears of higher prices and escalating tensions.
He says, I'm not watching the market. I believe that as far as I could throw a Honda Civic, right?
That the one thing he will respond to is when the stock market goes down. The stock market goes down and he changes his mind.
But in the meantime, there is real economic consequences for doing this, for the uncertainty that consumers and producers take.
But let's talk about the second possibility here, which is that Trump knows exactly what he's doing. When you spend some time observing Trump, you start to notice more and more how he very clearly enjoys the persona that he's carved out for himself of being a disruptor. Like when he's naming those countries he believes treat the US unfairly.
The European Union, China, Brazil, India, Mexico and Canada, have you heard of them?
Or when he's waving a pen at those same two economies who depend on the US the most.
They've been in the news lately, haven't they?
Or when he calls the president of Ukraine a dictator and days later jokes that he would never say such a thing.
Mr. President, do you still think that Mr. Zelensky is a dictator?
Did I say that? I can't believe I said that. Next question.
I do think that he thrives on the idea that we're having this conversation right now about what his strategy is here. I think he thrives on the idea that he's unwieldy and nobody really knows what's really going on.
Yes, it's this old paradox of how a bug is sometimes actually a feature. As in, Trump's leadership may not simply be a series of unforced errors, but rather an intentional set of moves designed to throw opponents off balance.
We see a lot of what they call the madman theory, basically make yourself look so unpredictable that your adversaries don't know what to believe about you.
And let's stop to consider who Trump might consider his adversaries. Countries like Canada and Mexico, yeah, and maybe not just Canada and Mexico.
The United States has been ripped off by virtually every country in the world.
But also, he's increasingly singled out and used incendiary language against those companies that do business with other countries.
Well, a lot of them are globalist countries and companies that won't be doing as well because we're taking back things that have been taken from us many years ago. Basically, you have globalist companies that have been ripping us off.
And I'll explain where I'm going with this. Trump has always been transparent about one thing, that he wants American manufacturing to return to America.
America will be a manufacturing nation once again.
And he's always been clear, tariffs are a way of forcing those companies who would dare to make product outside of the U.S. to relocate, to set up factories, to create jobs, to put America first.
He would, in his heart of hearts, like to have fewer cars built in Canada and Mexico and more cars built in Michigan and like North Carolina.
So what they have to do is build their car plants, frankly, and other things in the United States, in which case they have no tariffs.
And so there's a strategic line you can start to imagine where maybe you never actually have to apply tariffs to anything because maybe the threat is enough.
He's essentially trying to intimidate or provoke some response that he thinks he'll be able to take advantage of.
And if that's the case, the rubber banding, the pendulum brinksmanship starts to make more sense. If he thinks this is the most painless way to get what he wants eventually, that the prospect of perpetual, unending uncertainty is too much to bear. So from industry's point of view, let's just do as Trump wants and move operations to the States.
He's a lot more willing to try things than your average politician. We've seen over the course of the last month and a half, his entire month and a half in office in the second term, that there's just less of a barrier there to trying things. The Republican Party has decided to kind of hand him the keys.
Now, to be both fair and clear, Trump's aggressive style has produced material change globally in a way that we haven't really seen under previous presidents. Just look to Europe as an example, how they're scrambling to shore up mutual defense and defense spending directly because of how Trump treats the NATO alliance. But turning back to tariffs, there are two complications with his strategy. The first is whether what he's demanding is even possible.
You can't move automotive plants in anything less than 5 years. You're gonna have to close a plant, you gotta break the supply lines, you gotta find new supply lines, find a new site, build a new plant, get your multimodal access and your power there, and that's $2.5 billion per plant that you don't have sales against to amortize that cost. These privately owned, publicly traded companies that begged him to pull back from the brink, he's gonna bankrupt them before he gets what he thinks he wants.
But the second problem is that there may be a point at which Trump's adversaries stop riding the roller coaster. Canada seems to want off.
As I always say, you know, you touch a stove once and you get burnt. You don't touch that stove again. The only deal is drop the tariffs.
We're going to ensure that the Americans understand how pissed off we are.
We cannot live as Manitobans with a persistent threat of Donald Trump's tariff tax.
And consider how differently the federal government has responded to this latest pause compared to the first time. After Trump's first pause a month ago, the Prime Minister immediately pulled Canadian counter tariffs off the table. Trade war averted. Whew. But his response this time?
I can confirm that we will continue to be in a trade war that was launched by the United States for the foreseeable future.
Now, the Canadian government has withdrawn a future second wave of tariffs, but has decided to keep its current first wave on $30 billion worth of American goods in effect. And come Monday, which is in a few days from the time I'm recording this, Doug Ford of Ontario seems so far to be holding firm on his threat to jack up the price of electricity sold to Americans by 25%. So if Trump does indeed have a master plan, what comes next?
I don't know. I left my crystal ball in the other room. I'm sorry.
I don't know, and he doesn't know, which makes it very difficult to negotiate. How do you play that game when the rules keep shifting on an hourly, daily, weekly, monthly basis?
But I think we can make at least one prediction, that whether you think Trump is governing by impulse or has calculated his moves, whatever he says publicly has less and less value. Because when he says he's going to do something, maybe he will and maybe he won't. Even signed agreements like trade deals stop being meaningful if the US president can simply decide unilaterally to violate them, or at least threaten to. Ever since day one of Trump's presidency, he has threatened sweeping tariffs against Canada and Mexico.
We will tariff and tax foreign countries to enrich our citizens.
He negotiated, he delayed, and he backed off. Until now. Today, his original promise, 25% tariffs across the board on nearly all Canadian goods, is finally taking effect.
U.S. President Donald Trump's punishing tariffs are now in force.
What he wants is to see a total collapse of the Canadian economy, because that'll make it easier to annex us.
So what does this mean exactly? Why is he doing this? Why now? How badly will this hurt? And how is it we know this is just the beginning? So, effective today, Tuesday, March 4th, when I record this, U.S. imports from Canada and Mexico will be subject to a 25% tariff. The only carve-out is on energy, which in Canada's case mainly means oil. That's being taxed at 10%.
Canada's been very tough on oil, on energy. They don't allow a lot of things in, and we allow everything to come in. It's been a one-way street.
A tariff on Canada is simply a tax that the Trump administration will charge Americans who buy Canadian goods. So if an American store is stocking its shelves with whatever's in this Canadian box of goods, it used to cost $100 a box to import, but a 25% tariff means on top of that, the American buyer has to pay an additional $25 to the US government. And this affects all sorts of things Americans buy, probably without even realizing that they're coming from Canada. Food, medicine, cars, and then a whole lot of stuff used to make other stuff, like oil, lumber, and concrete. If those things become more expensive, then gas, furniture, even bridges and skyscrapers also become more expensive for Americans. That's the spiraling nature of tariffs, where they often affect more things than you'd think, and sometimes even affect the same thing multiple times if they cross the border multiple times. Because to use cars as an example, they aren't just built in one country. The engine might be built in one place, the transmission in another, then they're assembled in yet another place. And all of these components can cross national borders multiple times before they magically turn into a car. A tariff is charged at every such border crossing. All of this makes life more expensive, either for those American companies importing Canadian goods or the consumers who they then pass those costs down to, or a mix of both.
The damage has been done. We've lost millions of people due to fentanyl. It comes mostly from China, but it comes through Mexico and it comes through Canada.
We need to see real engagement on the fentanyl issue, on the drug issue. That is fundamentally the underlying element of these tariffs.
Trump's legal basis for imposing tariffs hinges on the belief that fentanyl entering the U.S. from Canada constitutes a national emergency. The White House cites this widely as the sole justification it needs.
The Canadians have allowed a lot of fentanyl to come into the country. It's not a defense to say more has come from Mexico, because way too much has come from Mexico too.
But putting equal tariffs on Canada and Mexico, as if to suggest they are equally responsible for the influx of fentanyl into the U.S., ignores one key fact.
Less than 1%.
Less than 1% of fentanyl that is in the U.S. comes from Canada.
Canada is not an issue in terms of source of illegal fentanyl into the United States.
Last year, U.S. agents only seized about 50 pounds of fentanyl at its northern border with Canada. Compare that to the more than 20,000 pounds, almost 10,000 kilos of fentanyl seized at the southern border with Mexico. But Canada had set that aside because tariffs constitute such an existential threat to this country's economy that in December of last year, the government scrambled.
Our new border plan, backed by an investment of $1.3 billion, will secure our border against the flow of illegal drugs and irregular migration.
This plan was all about new helicopters, surveillance, and personnel to crack down on Canada's side of the border. The result? The very next month, U.S. agents encountered dramatically less fentanyl on their side of the border. This is U.S. data, how much fentanyl they're stopping on their border with Canada. So You can see there are some months in 2024 where they seized 6 pounds of fentanyl. Here's 17 pounds, 7 pounds in September last year. But if I hover over January 2025, after Canada clamped down, US agents only came across 0.03 pounds of fentanyl the entire month.
Even the excuse that he's giving for these Paris tariffs today of fentanyl is completely bogus, completely unjustified, completely false.
So what I don't fully understand, just based on the raw numbers that I'm seeing, is whether there was ever truly a way for Canada to avoid Trump's tariffs. He has always been vague about what he even really wants, beyond the broadest goal that he wants fentanyl to stop flowing from Canada into the US, no matter that it's widely believed to make up the tiniest fraction of all fentanyl that comes in. And Trump has always appeared to have other reasons, besides the pretense of fentanyl, to want to put pressure on Canada's economy.
You need an emergency that you can sell to the American people. A fentanyl crisis does that. It's simply been a means to an objective, which was to gain tariff authority.
And he made this clear as recently as yesterday.
I would just say this to people in Canada or Mexico: if they're going to build car plants, the people that are doing them are much better off building here.
Yes, a big part of Trump's vision for tariffs is as a tool to bring manufacturing back to the U.S.
We have a tremendous deficit with Canada. We don't need them to make our cars. We don't need them to give us lumber.
We subsidize Canada by the tune of about $200 billion a year. And for what?
Tariffs force American buyers to make a tough choice. Continue buying Canadian with more and more tax piled on top, or buy American. And better still, if you're a company that currently makes things in Canada, because there, maybe you have access to the right skills, lower wages, a lower dollar, cheaper energy, well, things are about to get more expensive for you. So why don't you just save yourself the trouble and relocate everything to the States? That's America first.
The United States has been ripped off by virtually every country in the world.
America will be a manufacturing nation once again.
There is no question a 25% tariff on Canada will be devastating for its economy, because a country like Canada relies much more on the U.S. than the U.S. relies on Canada.
78% of our exports go to the United States. And so if those exports are suddenly 25% more expensive, then Americans aren't going to buy them. Or they may buy what they need, but they're going to buy significantly less.
If experts are right that Canada's GDP could very plausibly take, say, a modest 2% hit to GDP, maybe that doesn't sound like a lot, but on $2 trillion of GDP, 2% is $40 billion. That's more than what Canada has typically spent on its entire national defense budget. That's a huge amount of money that has a domino effect across entire industries: forestry, agriculture, the auto sector.
Weaponized uncertainty instills fear into foreign investors, and it also instills fear into Canadian companies that maybe I need to move that plant expansion to the other side of the border.
And the U.S., too, would feel some pain. Canada and Mexico, in that order, are the two largest bilateral trading partners the U.S. has. From those two countries alone, Americans buy almost $1 trillion worth of goods each year. A tariff makes those goods more expensive.
It will reduce the amount of income in consumers' pockets to go spend on restaurants, cars, home renovations.
Estimates for just how much more expensive things will get are going to vary wildly, because it really depends on how much of the tariffs companies absorb so that consumers don't have to. But two things. Consumer spending accounted for almost 70% of US GDP last year. It is the driver of the American economy. So if prices go up, as experts widely predict, and inflation gets worse, the economy as a whole suffers in a big way, because the American economic engine relies so heavily on people buying stuff. But also consider, Canada is planning to hit back.
I want to speak first directly to the American people. We don't want this, and we don't want to see you hurt either. But your government has chosen to do this to you.
In all, it has plotted out counter tariffs of 25% on $155 billion worth of American goods. And we're talking a whole range of stuff from American clothes, cosmetics, carpets, shampoo, furniture, jewelry, to more significant items that have serious supply chain implications, like steel and aluminum. Making those American products more expensive for Canadians to buy has a very specific goal: to hurt American industry.
It's trying to use soft power to target products that will have minimal damage to Canadian consumers, but inflict maximum damage on American politicians.
What's next is a very tricky question, because on this file especially, Trump has been so unequivocal, yet so unpredictable at the same time, that it's like trying to read tea leaves while they're still in the bag, and the bag is on fire. After months of talk on tariffs, the stock market has only now seemed to decide it's time to take this seriously. Markets took a sharp downward turn once it became clear these 25% tariffs are unavoidable.
The stock markets have reacted very badly to this announcement from Donald Trump.
You've seen a bit of pent-up reaction to this flooding into the markets.
And there's more to come. Just last week, Trump signed an executive order to investigate whether there should be new tariffs on lumber. 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum are scheduled to kick in on March 12th. Reciprocal tariffs are expected to go into effect April 2nd. And now, also on that same day, to the great farmers of the United States, tariffs will go on external product on April 2nd. Have fun. And who knows what other tariffs Trump will pull out of his hat. But think of today as phase one. The threat Trump has been making for months, now made real. $240,000. That's the number of temporary foreign workers the Canadian government allowed Canadian employers to bring into the country last year. It's the most ever on record, and almost double the number that they approved just 2 years ago. But here's another number: 1.4 million. That's about how many Canadians are without a job and looking right now. That's got some economists arguing that this program, meant to be an extraordinary measure to be used when a qualified Canadian isn't able to fill a job vacancy, that it's evolved into something else entirely.
It's really moved a long way past its intention as a program.
In the approval rate, it has gone from about 70% to now it is about 97%.
This low-wage stream has grown absolutely out of control.
And the concern is that shift is having very real, very serious consequences for the country and on younger Canadians looking for work. Let me explain. Canada's foreign worker program was originally designed to fill positions mostly in agriculture. You can think of a local farm that needs seasonal workers to help with its harvest each year. Other industries could use foreign workers too, but there was a cap, no more than 10% of your workforce. But then
we're short employees.
Reports of businesses struggling to rehire.
Restaurants, fast food, and retail in particular were struggling. They had open jobs that they couldn't fill, to the point where they didn't even have enough people to stay open. What they needed, they said, was to be able to bring people into work from overseas. Open the floodgates.
There is just quite simply a tremendous amount of lobbying pressure from businesses in Canada. And so the government, at a time when there were really, job vacancies were very high, they had hit record levels, they responded to that threat by essentially opening up the system.
So the system, as it was, capped foreign workers at 10% of a business's workforce. But a couple of years ago, the government bumped that up to 20% across the board, and all the way up to 30% for more than half a dozen industries. And look what happened. This chart from the Globe and Mail shows how many workers Canadian employers were allowed to bring into the country each year to fill the category of low-wage jobs. So that's the blue line that you see here. Entry-level positions in retail, construction, manufacturing, transportation. But what's behind this big jump that you see over the past 2 years is the food service industry. Hiring of foreign workers in that category is up close to 5,000% since 2018. According to Bloomberg, in Ontario, Tim Hortons took on 58 temporary foreign workers in 2019, but last year it was over 700.
This has been a big transformative change. This is tens of thousands of extra temporary foreign workers, particularly at coffee shops and convenience stores, ice cream places, and that kind of workplace.
Now, there are still rules in place to make sure businesses aren't just filling as many positions as possible with cheap labor. It is supposed to be a last resort, right? So, for example, they have to post the job locally first and make the case that the pay they're offering for the job is fair.
I mean, these are what we call generically labor market tests. They're essentially just a way for the government to ensure that these are genuine labor market needs that can't be satisfied locally with local labor.
And I think this is an attempt to sort of protect Canadian workers. The problem is, in practice, it doesn't work that well.
Because it's very hard to determine whether or not that's the case, whether there really aren't local sources of labor supplies.
And that's a really important point, something that's hard to verify with an application. So, for example, if a business says it had no qualified local applicants for a job, a bureaucrat looking at their application to hire foreign workers has to determine, well, what does that mean? How do I tell if someone was or wasn't qualified, especially when you're posting a job with no formal education or technical requirements?
It isn't that there's, these hard rules that must be satisfied. It is quite simply a very sort of subjective, you have to document that you have made efforts.
The experts we spoke to say it's gotten to the point where the requirements are so nebulous and there are so many applications coming in, they're just being rubber stamped.
When the probability that your application is accepted with a 97% success rate, there's really not much of a test anymore.
And if you're thinking, well, maybe 97% of applications are perfectly legitimate uses of the program, well, just look at what happens when the government does go back later to audit those companies. This is a rolling list of businesses that have received fines over the past few years for breaking the rules. And take this audit of Dynasty Produce in Cobourg, Ontario, just as an example. The company was fined $25,000 last month because the job details it wrote on the application didn't match what the job actually was. The government handed out more than $2 million in fines, just like this past year. And here's the thing. The government not only opened the floodgates in 2022, it removed the guardrails as well. Here's what I mean. There used to be a rule that applications in the food and retail sectors would be automatically rejected if the local unemployment rate was 6% or higher. So the thinking being that if lots of locals were looking for work, there should be no reason to depend on cheap foreign labor. But in 2022, the government got rid of that rule. And take a look at the city of Toronto's unemployment rate. For most of the past 2 years, it's been above 6%. And by now, almost every major Canadian city has reached 6%, some even higher than that.
If the unemployment rate is that high, it seems like there are a lot of people who could be filling these job vacancies.
One of the big concerns for economists right now is the impact all of this is having on young people.
All of these jobs are important jobs, but they're also jobs that, especially in the fast food sector, this is often, young Canadians' first jobs.
Now again, this program is supposed to be a last resort to fill jobs when there aren't any Canadian workers available. But let's look again at Toronto. There are about 120,000 people between 15 and 24 looking for work. That's an increase of 50% in just 2 years.
The CNE says they received 37,000 applications this year. the most in the X's history.
The competition was a lot because they wouldn't even read my emails, they wouldn't even call back.
On that question of callbacks, the economists we spoke to say some companies actually prefer to hire temporary foreign workers over young Canadians because they're generally more mature, they have more life experience, and in many cases, they're much less likely to complain about low pay or poor working conditions.
I mean, the research I've done shows that, there's reasons to think that employers will pitch a low wage when they advertise. If the search fails, hope that the government gives them permission to hire a temporary foreign worker.
There are ways of, advertising on sites that aren't used as much, perhaps putting in some exotic type requirements and then saying, well, yes, we had 37 domestic applicants, but none of them met our needs. So we have to go overseas.
So it's not difficult if you really have a preference for the foreign candidate over the Canadian candidate to say that the Canadian candidate wasn't somehow suitable. And I think that's ultimately what the problem is with these tests.
And take a look at this. Between the time these new rules were introduced in 2022 and now, the national youth unemployment rate has spiked from around 9% to over 14%. And for young immigrants who've landed in Canada in the past 5 years, it's even worse, around 23%.
A fiercely competitive job market means young people across Vancouver are struggling to score work.
There's no question that this is negatively impacting the employment prospects for younger people.
But there's also another side to this coin, because it's also probably true that some young people just aren't applying to these service sector jobs because they don't think the pay is high enough. And maybe the pay isn't high enough because employers have access to people who think the pay is just fine.
We should keep in mind that, what they're trying to do is bring in temporary foreign workers at the current wage rather than raising their wages and trying to attract more domestic labor. So even when the program is working as designed, it's suppressing wage growth for the folks who are already in Canada.
Think of it this way. If I own a food truck in Ontario and I'm posting a job because I need someone to help me flip burgers, I'm going to post it at minimum wage. In Ontario, that's $16.55 an hour. A few days pass, and I'm not getting any takers. So I say, okay, maybe I need to make the job a little bit more attractive. We're not gonna pay minimum wage. Instead, we're gonna pay $18 an hour. And boom, suddenly, a lot more people are interested. But what happens if I don't have to do that? And if instead I can just apply to hire someone temporarily from another country where $16.55 an hour suits them just fine?
Before we had temporary foreign worker programs, the process would be that you had to pay the competitive wage, and the competitive wage is where supply equals demand. The temporary foreign worker program, in a sense, hijacks that process.
And if wages are stagnating instead of rising, that adds up over time. Here's just how little wages in this category have grown since 2010. End to end, this is an increase of 50 cents, maybe a little bit more. And this is adjusted for inflation, but still. Now, is this solely because of the temporary foreign worker program? No. But the economists we spoke to say it is very likely contributing.
If there are jobs in the economy that Canadians won't do, maybe we should start asking ourselves why Canadians won't do those jobs. Maybe we should be asking ourselves, well, maybe the problem is those jobs just aren't attractive enough, and that needs to change.
For the most part, the businesses that rely on temporary foreign workers see all of this from a very different perspective. They say taking away these workers would mean they'd have to bump up prices, lay off staff, or even shut down altogether.
Canada, like many other countries, has become addicted to temporary foreign workers.
There may be some firms that could not survive at, if they have to raise their wage from $17 to $18 or to $19. But we have to ask ourselves, what do we want more? Do we want a handful of marginally profitable businesses to survive? Or do we want to see wages go up for hundreds of thousands of young Canadians? In my mind, that's an easy trade-off.
Some economists even go so far as to say this program has taken too much pressure off Canadian businesses, because when they know that they can hire a whole bunch of ultra low wage workers, there's much less incentive to make large scale investments, develop new processes, or adopt new technologies to become more efficient. And we know Canadian businesses are falling behind in all of those areas.
We have a labor productivity problem in this country. The way we increase labor productivity is not by working harder. It's by working smarter. It's by giving workers the tools, the equipment, the machinery, the technology that allows them to produce more every hour that they work. That's what we need.
Now, there is a broader question worth asking about who else the temporary foreign worker program potentially hurts, including temporary foreign workers themselves. But the federal government has made some small tweaks to the program over the past few weeks, and they've promised there's more to come. Now, it's not clear whether they'll roll back all of the changes they made in 2022 or try to adjust the application process. But some of the economists we spoke to said if it were up to them, it wouldn't be a question of what to change. They'd cut this low-wage stream we've been talking about entirely. The federal government just made a major cut to its immigration plan for both permanent and temporary residents, with the goal of not just slowing population growth in Canada, but actually reducing it to basically zero.
It's reducing permanent immigration levels by at least 20%.
Cutting temporary immigrant numbers by nearly 500,000 a year.
This is a huge about face for the Liberal government.
They basically hit pause on the system for 3 years.
It's just unbelievable, dramatic revision downwards.
The government had been signaling for a while that it was going to make some changes to its immigration plan, but no one we spoke to expected the cuts to be this big. So why such a dramatic U-turn? Let's go through it. When the Prime Minister announced these cuts to Canada's immigration plan, he said there was one main priority.
To give all levels of government time to catch up. Time to make the necessary investments in healthcare, in housing, in social services to accommodate more people in the future.
At its core, this is a story about a massive spike in demand for housing, for public services, and a supply that just couldn't keep up. And here's what I mean. On average, over the past few decades, Canada's population has grown by somewhere between 200 and 600,000 people per year. That dropped off during the pandemic when borders were closed. But look what happened since then. Canada's population has grown by more than 1 million people over the past 2 years.
That type of population growth in kind of a rich country is unheard of. That's just off the charts.
Canada usually grows by around 300,000 people a year, so to be growing by over 1 million is substantial.
We haven't had that sort of population growth in really more than a century.
And if you look back at the federal government's immigration forecast a few years ago, they said the plan was to welcome around 1.2 million new immigrants over a 3-year period. That was already a record-breaking number that made headlines all over the world. But here's the thing. That forecast didn't include any mention of temporary residents that would end up coming to Canada over those 3 years. And by temporary, we mean international students and temporary foreign workers.
So after the pandemic, there was a narrative of a labor shortage crisis. There was a belief that, we're in an economy now where we can't have too many immigrants entering the country. There can't be too many. I mean, our job vacancies are so high, they've reached 1 million. We just need more workers.
This was an urgent problem that needed fixing. And there was no target, no limit set on how many of these temporary visas the government could hand out. So the door was thrown wide open. And Canada's population actually grew by about 3 million people in 3 years, almost triple the official forecast. And according to Statistics Canada, if you're comparing natural population growth to immigration, 98% of that growth was from immigration. it took a lot of people by surprise, including the provinces and cities that became home to all of these new people.
560,000 temporary immigrants, it's too much.
The number of people coming here is too fast.
This growth was so sudden and it caught policymakers off guard that there was basically no time to react.
They lost control of the system. It was a runaway train that they couldn't slow down.
Even the Prime Minister himself has acknowledged this.
In the tumultuous times as we emerged from the pandemic, between addressing labor needs and maintaining population growth, we didn't get the balance quite right.
Now, in terms of what exactly local and provincial governments need time to catch up on, Trudeau mentioned 3 specific things.
Healthcare, in housing, in social services.
Let's start with housing. When a country's population is growing, you need more homes for people to live in, right? Here's what that looked like over the past few decades. You can see it's about a 2-to-1 ratio, new people to new homes, which is, according to urban planners, around where you want to be. But the gap started to grow a little bit between 2016 and the pandemic. And then by 2021, it had basically doubled. Canada is now building, on average, 1 new home for every 4 new working age people. And this mismatch between supply and demand doesn't just mean it's become harder to find a place to live, which it has. It's also driven up prices.
You get a big sudden increase in the demand for housing. When you combine that with a very, what we call, inelastic, unresponsive supply of housing, then you get big increases in prices.
In early 2020, right before the pandemic, the average cost of a house in Canada was around $540,000. By 2022, that shot up to a whopping $840,000. It's since leveled off a little, but a home is still almost $200,000 more expensive than it was pre-pandemic. And it's not much better if you're renting. Last year, according to the CMHC, Canada had the lowest vacancy rate ever on record. And what happens when your landlord knows there's a line of people waiting to fill their unit? They bump up the rent. Play that out across the entire country, and you get this, a record-breaking jump in the average cost of rent. Now, to be clear, house prices in Canada have been high for a while now. And yes, unaffordability is made worse by high interest rates, building costs, red tape. It's all part of the picture too. But even the Bank of Canada has been clear that strong population growth has added pressure to house prices and rents. And there was concern among economists that pressure was only going to keep building. A recent CIBC report estimated, even if the population continued to grow slightly less than it has over the past couple of years, we'd still have a shortage of about 5 million houses by 2030. And building 5 million units in the next 6 years, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone, who thinks that's realistic.
The reality is that when you add 1.3 million people to the population within the space of the year, we can't possibly match that on the supply side.
Okay, so in a free market, prices are intimately linked to the balance between supply and demand. That makes sense. But what happens when there's a supply and demand problem for public services, like healthcare?
What you get are shortages and queues and lineups. People waiting longer and longer to get a service.
Now, the problems with Canada's healthcare system are wide-ranging and complex. It is a system suffering from regional disparities, record numbers of burnt-out healthcare workers, an aging population, but it also hasn't grown as fast as the number of people who need it. In 2019, there were just over 91,000 doctors in Canada. Over the next 4 years, there were about 6,000 more. But for a population that's grown by millions in that time. So what does that mean for all those people who need a doctor? Essentially, fewer and fewer have access to one. Researchers estimate the number of Canadians without a family doctor went from about 4.5 million in 2019 to about 6.5 million in 2023. And a recent Angus Reid survey suggests more often than not, it's recent immigrants that are suffering most from this discrepancy.
More and more people are coming here, not being able to access the care they need in a timely manner.
And often what happens is if you can't see your family doctor, you end up having to go to emergency because of a lack of options.
And let's talk about the ER. Last year, there were 1 million more emergency room visits in Canada than the year before, which has meant those admitted are now waiting about 40% longer than they were in 2020.
And it's really put a tremendous amount of pressure on the hospital system, but also primary care.
Big population swings like this can also have a big impact on infrastructure. Take PEI. Last year, the province saw a 33% jump in immigration, the highest on record. And its regional power provider, Maritime Electric, says it hasn't had time to update its grid, and it's about to reach capacity.
This year, we're over 90,000 customers. That's a new threshold for us. If we get into cold weather events for extended periods of times, it could be a challenge for us.
We've seen massive population growth over the past years, particularly in the area of temporary workers and temporary residents. And we are now saying, okay, we need to let our communities, our infrastructures catch up to the population.
And that's the crux of this. Canada's population grew by a lot, really fast. Housing, infrastructure, public services, they've been buckling under the pressure. And everyone, including and often especially new immigrants, have been suffering because of it. But one other thing that might explain why the government acted so drastically, so suddenly. Public support for Canada's immigration system has been dropping fast.
The consensus in and around immigration is one that is under threat in Canada. Canadians have some legitimate questions about the increase and the rapidity of the increase.
A recent national survey suggests around half of Canadians now view immigration as harmful to the country. That's up 10 points from last year. And what's driving this shift? A so-called scarcity mindset, according to the survey authors, when it comes to housing, healthcare, and social services. So, solving this problem quickly might be as much a political matter as it is a pragmatic one for the Liberal government.
They really realize that it's a weak spot for them, that the immigration file has become something that a lot of voters are talking about.
And so they're sending a message to voters saying, we hear you, we are going to respond in a big time way. We understand that we didn't get this right. A mea culpa. It's very clearly a mea culpa.
The big question's now, to what extent will slashing immigration fix the problems that we've mentioned? And what of the reason that Canada welcomed so many new immigrants in the first place? How will this affect the economy that's only avoided a recession over the past year or so because of immigration? The number of people claiming asylum in Canada has risen steadily over the past few years. But between 2022 and now, it has skyrocketed. And 90% of those claims are being made in just 2 provinces, both of which are now struggling and asking the federal government for help.
They're bringing these people in, and God bless them, but they aren't funding it.
The problem is urgent.
Now, there's no doubt that some of this spike is related to just how many people are living in dangerous situations around the world right now. But what else explains this sudden rise? According to UN data, a few years ago, Canada cracked the top 10 countries receiving asylum claims. But last year, this country shot up to number 5. And in 2024, if the current trajectory continues, Canada could reach the top 3.
We have watered down the screening so significantly on our immigration program.
3 million people, over 7% of our population, are temporary residents. That is unprecedented.
How the government didn't anticipate this is quite troubling.
If you're fleeing persecution or violence in your home country and you're looking to claim refugee status somewhere safer, you have a couple of options. One, you can apply as part of a resettlement program. These programs exist across North America and Europe. They generally accept refugees from war-torn areas, and they essentially handpick a certain number of people to resettle in their country. Another option for someone fleeing violence is to just physically go to another country and file an asylum claim once you're on that country's soil. Canada has welcomed hundreds of thousands of people through the first stream, its resettlement program, which this year has been heavily focused on Ukraine. But it's usually pretty insulated from that second kind of uncontrolled migration, mostly because of our geography. Canada is surrounded by ocean on 3 sides and really far away from most other countries.
You don't have the same issues like with the UK and the Channel and people coming in through Europe that way. You don't have the issue with people coming in through Mexico and all of, South and Central America coming into the United States. You just don't have that. We're just protected geographically.
Before last year, about half of asylum claims filed in Canada came from Canada's only neighbor, the US. The vast majority crossing over by foot in Quebec. But the government closed that Roxham Road crossing in early 2023. Now, less than 10% of Canada's asylum seekers are coming over the US border. And yet, like we said, asylum claims have skyrocketed since then. So where are these tens of thousands of new claims coming from? Well, according to the analysts we spoke to, around the same time the Canadian government signed that agreement with the US, they also made it significantly easier for people to get here by air, asylum seekers being among those people.
When they got the opportunity to step on Canadian soil, they said, this is my chance. I'm going to make an asylum-seeking claim and try and stay in Canada over the long term.
Here's what happened. Traditionally, if you wanted to travel to Canada from one of the countries on this list, there are 140 of them, you couldn't just book a flight and expect to pass through customs. You needed a visitor visa and to prove that you had plans to return home. The reason this list exists, according to the analysts we spoke to, is that these countries are considered higher risk for asylum claims.
We want to make sure that officers are convinced that an applicant has enough establishment in their home country and there's a clear purpose of why they're coming to Canada. They're not going to overstay.
Before 2023, if you were from one of these countries, you had to show a return ticket, you had to show where you were staying, and you had to prove that you had the money to support yourself while you were visiting. But then, at the beginning of 2023, the Canadian government quietly decided to waive those screening requirements for the rest of the year. The reason, they said, was to help reduce a massive backlog of over 2 million visitor applications in the system.
Because they were facing such large backlogs, the government came up with an internal policy of waiving the eligibility assessment.
So they were less stringent about reviewing some of these applications to come here on temporary visas because they just wanted to get through the backlog.
And according to an internal memo that the Globe and Mail got a hold of around the time of the decision, the government